This is CNN Breaking News.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your new day. And we do begin with breaking news because moments ago, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders announcing that he is getting into the presidential race. This will be his second bid, the independent senator. He was the runner-up, you'll remember, for the Democratic nomination in 2016. He joins an already crowded field of at least 10 Democratic candidates.
Sanders lost a hard-fought battle to Hillary Clinton for the nomination in 2016, but he did win more than 20 states, and he shook up the Democratic Party. There is no question about that. He made his announcement on Vermont Public Radio and now has a campaign video for his 2020 bid. CNN's Ryan Nobles is live in Washington. He's been covering the Sanders campaign. That's been all of 17 minutes long at this point and has the latest details. Ryan.
John and Allison, good morning. And of course, it probably doesn't come as that big of a surprise to many Americans that Bernie Sanders has decided to run for president again. But there was a pretty intense deliberation among Sanders and his closest aides over the last several weeks as to when he should get in and the way he would get in. And he's doing it this morning with that interview on Vermont Public Radio and an email blast to his vast network of supporters that includes a video which outlines his rationale for running again after running in 2016. Take a listen to a part of that video.
Hi, I'm Bernie Sanders. I'm running for president, and I'm asking you today to be part of an unprecedented grassroots campaign of 1 million active volunteers in every state in our country. Our campaign is not only about defeating Donald Trump, the most dangerous president in modern American history. It is not only about winning the Democratic nomination and the general election. Our campaign is about transforming our country and creating a government based on the principles of economic, social, racial, and environmental justice.
And of course, the situation for Sanders in 2020 is going to be much different than it was in 2016. He surprised many people by waking up a progressive wing of the party that had not been as engaged as it had been in past presidential cycles. And many of the issues that Sanders ran on 4 years ago were deemed radical. Things like Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, and free college tuition. They've now become part of the mainstream conversation and almost the price of entry for many of these Democratic candidates that have already entered the field. And of course, Sanders is also going to have a much better focus on certain aspects of the Democratic base that he did not do that well with in 2016, including female voters and African-American voters. He's already made entries into those communities, specifically the African-American community, by visiting South Carolina around Martin Luther King Day and meeting with black leaders in that key early state. And of course, one of the big issues the Sanders campaign is going to have to contend with are accusations of rampant sexual harassment in that 2016 campaign. Sanders has addressed that already. He's apologized and he's met with some of those accusers. But John and Allison, no doubt Bernie Sanders is a political force. He's one of the most recognizable politicians in America. He comes in now with no one surprised by his entry. It's going to be much different than it was 4 years ago.
It sure is, Ryan. Thank you. Stay with us if you would, because we have some questions for you. We also want to bring in MJ Lee, CNN national politics reporter, Harry Enton, CNN politics senior writer and analyst, and Nia Malika Henderson, CNN senior political reporter. Okay, Harry, let me start with you because it's a crowded field already. We'll pull up the graphic. So there are already at least 10 Democrats running. It's much different than just the short time ago that was 2016. You know, he occupied his own lane, it seemed, back then. Now it's an HOV lane. So how does that change?
I mean, look, last time, part of the reason he did so well was because he was the only real opponent to Hillary Clinton. And you see that in the polling right now. He starts off at 16% versus getting 43% of the national primary vote. More than that, if you look at the left side of the party, last time around, he was the main liberal challenger to Hillary Clinton. This time around, last week I did these slides, how far left is the Democratic field? He's still the furthest left, but there are people joining him. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, even Kirsten Gillibrand, whose record has obviously shifted towards the left in the last few years. And so I think it will be more difficult for him to distinguish himself, but he starts off with the base and a lot of passionate supporters, so we'll see what happens.
And yeah, he was runner-up last time, and that generally means something in both parties. People know him. There are a lot of very passionate supporters. So tell me where you think, what space does he occupy in this Democratic field?
I think he's mainly going to be just a voice for the left. It's really hard to imagine who the Bernie Sanders voter is at this point beyond what we know the Bernie Sanders voter has been. And it's sort of the Bernie bro, right? Somebody who's a bit younger, whiter, I think, than the overall Democratic primary process usually is in those voter groups. So it's hard to see what sort of lane in terms of building some sort of multiracial coalition. It is interesting, though. He clearly is mindful of that. Oh, yeah. While he has moved, I think, the party left on any number of issues, Medicare for all and college tuition. He himself has been moved left on issues around race by the party itself, right? He was very uncomfortable in many ways talking about race. In 2016, there were some sort of uncomfortable interactions he had with Black Lives Matter protesters. You see in that announcement video, he mentions racial equality, right? And that's something I think we're going to hear quite a bit from him. He calls the president a racist. Not every candidate has done that so far. And so we'll see how that plays. But I think it's still going to be difficult, I think, for him to expand what we know are that core group of supporters, which are primarily younger voters, as well as white voters as well, and primarily male voters. But we'll see. He's going to be an interesting voice out there in this very, very crowded field.
MJ, he talked about the political revolution in his announcement, the political revolution that he started, he said a few years ago, and now it's time to finish it. But you've been out on the trail with people who have filled that void in the time that he hasn't been in the race. There are people who think that they're carrying the mantle of that political revolution.
Absolutely. And it was fascinating, in that video, Bernie Sanders referred to people joining this unprecedented grassroots movement. The reality is this movement is no longer unprecedented because he did it back in 2016. He's now running for a second time in 2020. And I think there is something important to be said about a difference in a candidate being a first-time runner and trying again for a second time. And purely anecdotally, when you're out in Iowa, New Hampshire, the early states, talking to voters who are undecided right now, but coming out to see what the Democratic candidates have to say, you definitely see that there are former Bernie supporters out there who want to know now this time around, among the buffet of options that I have this time around, who is going to speak to me the most. Not everyone is going to be loyally supportive of Bernie Sanders just because they voted for him last time, because as everyone else has mentioned on this panel, he is not alone this time in challenging sort of the establishment-backed, more moderate and centrist candidate. He is going to be joined by so many others who, in large part, were inspired by the message that he had in 2016, and every sort of platform and idea and policy idea that he brought into the mainstream for the Democratic Party. So he is not alone this time, and he is not a new face this time, and that is so important.
I thought when I saw Elizabeth Warren announcing last night and today universal child care through kindergarten, I thought maybe she was preemptively trying to get this policy out there to take some of the air out of the Bernie balloon that's rising today. But you tell me that she was going to do it no matter what today anyway.
Well, and I think when she's releasing these policy positions, I don't know if they're necessarily pegged to other candidates getting in, but she is making sure that her policy positions are very clear very early on. And we're not seeing all of the other candidates necessarily doing this, but the fact that even in just this year, and we're only in the month of February, that she has this wealth tax plan that's already out. She has this universal child care plan that's already out. That means that Bernie Sanders is going to have some catch up to do in terms of making sure that he lays out fresh proposals that are clear to the people so that they know what they're voting for this time around.
Ryan, what about the scandal that cropped up on the Bernie Sanders campaign, or the accusations that women who worked on that campaign did not feel that they always got a fair shake and felt somewhat mistreated? Where is that now?
Well, listen, Allison, there's no doubt that this is going to be a problem for Bernie Sanders. This is a cloud that hangs over his campaign for the way it was conducted back in 2016. But I talked to a lot of people that were big supporters of Bernie Sanders 4 years ago, people within the campaign who did acknowledge and perhaps were even victims of sexual harassment during that campaign. And very few of them actually blame Bernie Sanders himself. They believe that he just did not have a full grasp as to what was happening at every level of his campaign. And they really want to give him the opportunity opportunity to make things better this time around. And Sanders has already made steps in that direction. He met with some of those accusers. He apologized for the way that they were treated during his campaign. And they've already implemented changes in terms of the human resources infrastructure that existed in 2016 versus how it's going to be run this time around. I think the big issue here for Sanders, though, is that you're not seeing a ton of criticism from his fellow competitors in this race. And that's because within the confines of these massive campaign infrastructures, there's concern that he's not the only person that perhaps had these problems within the campaign. I think the big issue for him is how he deals with it and how it's handled going forward. But, guys, in a field with so many candidates and so many of them essentially espousing the same political beliefs, one little miscue like this could be something that could make a voter go in a different direction. And there's no doubt that that's something Bernie Sanders is going to have to deal with.
And they may be careful about going after Bernie Sanders because many of them have adopted so many of his ideas over the last few years and they have become Democratic mainstream to a certain extent.